sea along Washington's northern coast is quiet in a way that feels wrong. It doesn't roar or crash like it should. It breathes, slow, heavy, almost human. At the edge of that stillness stands what remains of Northpoint Lighthouse, built in 1892 to guard one of the most unpredictable stretches of ocean in America. Today, it is little more than stone and rust, half buried in mist. But more than a century ago, it was home to 3 men who vanished without a sound. In December of 1919, the light that guided passing ships suddenly went dark. Mariners reported confusion at sea, and when the supply vessel Artemis finally arrived 4 days later, its crew found the lighthouse abandoned. The front door was unlocked. Inside, a single chair had fallen over beside a table set for dinner. Bread hardened on the plate, cups of coffee had gone cold, and a clock had stopped at 8:47. One of the keeper's coats still hung neatly by the door, as if he had meant to return in a moment, but never did. Their names were Thomas Grady, Walter Hill, and Elias Ward, 3 men of very different lives bound by the same isolation. Grady, the head keeper, had tended the light for nearly 20 years, a stoic veteran who believed the sea demanded respect, not fear. Hill, his assistant, was newly married and saving money to start a small orchard inland. Ward, the youngest, was a substitute just 2 weeks into his assignment. Together, they were meant to endure storms, maintain the lamp, and record each passing day in the logbook. That logbook was found open on the desk. The last entry read, "The wind sounds different tonight." There were no more words after that. Investigators would later claim the men were swept away by a storm, though the weather that week had been calm, clear skies, mild waves, no record of any gale strong enough to reach the tower. Others speculated one man might have killed the others in a fit of madness, but there was no sign of struggle, no blood, no weapons, nothing missing. Everything inside the lighthouse was in order. Everything except the men. When the relief crew searched the surrounding cliffs, they found only fragments of boot prints leading toward the edge, then stopping abruptly. Not sliding, not dragged, just gone, as though the men had stepped off into the air, the official report from the United States. Lighthouse Service labeled the case an unfortunate accident, but the phrasing felt like a way to close a file rather than solve it. Sailors who frequented the coast refused to believe it was weather. They spoke instead of lights seen above the ocean that same night, 3 pale orbs moving against the wind. A fishing crew anchored miles south claimed they heard a low humming that vibrated through the hull of their ship for nearly an hour, though the sea was calm and the air still. Locals began to avoid the area. Farmers in nearby hamlets swore they saw the light burn again weeks later, a weak pulse shining from a tower that no longer had a working lamp. When they approached the shoreline, the glow vanished. The disappearances at Northpoint weren't the first, nor were they the last. From Maine to Oregon, similar incidents had been whispered about for decades, small teams of keepers who vanished, their stations left perfectly intact. The sea kept its pattern. The authorities kept their silence. Standing on that coast today, the remnants of the lighthouse tilt slightly toward the water, its broken glass reflecting nothing but fog. Salt has eaten through the metal railings. The stairs creak when the wind moves, and beneath the corrosion, faint marks still line the wall near the entrance. 3 parallel scratches, as though made by human fingers trying to hold on. No one lives there now. No ships rely on its light. Yet fishermen still report seeing a faint beam sweep across the bay every few winters, just before midnight, when the moon is thin and the tide is low. Maybe it's the mind playing tricks in the mist. Maybe it's something else. The archives tell us that when a lighthouse goes dark, it takes days for anyone to notice. Out there, surrounded by sea, a man could vanish 1,000 times before the world would ever know. And in 1919, at Northpoint, 3 of them did. What happened inside that tower remains uncertain, a mystery buried beneath tide and time. But the silence it left behind lingers, carried by the wind that still moves through broken windows, whispering the same sound the last keeper once wrote about. The wind does sound different there. In 1919, America stood on the edge of a fragile peace. The Great War had ended only months earlier, and the country was learning how to breathe again. The coasts, once alive with ships carrying soldiers and cargo, had quieted. But on the far northwestern edge of Washington state, the ocean was still wild, restless, untamed. And in that forgotten corner stood the lighthouse, Northpoint Light, built not for glory, but for survival. Life as a lighthouse keeper was not a career. It was a sentence of solitude wrapped in duty. The men chosen for it were often veterans, widowers, or men with nowhere else to go. They were selected for endurance, not conversation, for reliability, not comfort. In an age before radios and regular contact, their lives existed between the sound of waves and the rhythm of the lamp. Each night they wound the clockwork mechanism that kept the light spinning. Each morning, they polished the lens until it shone clear as water. Days blurred into one another, marked only by log entries, tides, and storms. Isolation was considered part of the job. Keepers were expected to endure it without complaint. The United States Lighthouse Service provided no psychologists, no support for families, no leave for loneliness. Letters arrived only once every 2 weeks by supply boat, if weather allowed. Illness, injury, or grief had to be managed alone. The men who served in these towers often became quiet, inward, and strange in the eyes of others. By 1919, many coastal communities treated their lighthouse keepers with both respect and distance. They were essential, but not quite ordinary. The light made them different, men who watched from the edges of the world while others slept safely inland. In nearby fishing towns like Port Angeles and Nia Bay, stories grew around them. Some said the keepers could predict storms before they came. Others believed their solitude made them see things no one else could, the shapes in fog, the whispers in the wind. At the time, maritime superstition was not rare. Even as science advanced and radio technology began creeping into coastal operations, the ocean remained an unpredictable force. Sailors hung charms in their cabins, carved crosses into wooden decks, and refused to set sail on Fridays. The line between rationality and faith blurred easily where the sea was concerned. If a man vanished at sea, it was accepted that the ocean had simply taken him back. But in the early 20th century, the Pacific Northwest carried a different kind of darkness. The weather there wasn't just cold, it was relentless. Thick fog rolled in for weeks, cutting off visibility to a few feet. The damp crept into walls and bones alike. Even inside the lighthouse, salt coated every surface. Lantern wicks molded, bread spoiled in days. A man could go months without seeing another face, save for the 2 others assigned to the same rotation. For keepers like Thomas Grady, routine was the only defense against madness. Every morning at 6, he climbed the tower to check the lamp. He logged wind direction, temperature, and tide height, his handwriting small and deliberate. At noon, he inspected the machinery, then walked the outer platform, scanning for driftwood or wreckage. At dusk, he lit the wick and began the long vigil through the night. When storms came, he barely slept, pacing, adjusting the beam, ensuring it never failed. There was pride in that monotony. The light was sacred. It meant safety for others. Keepers saw themselves as unseen guardians. But with that duty came a quiet decay of the mind. Many grew superstitious, convinced the lamp itself carried a consciousness, that it watched them as much as they watched the sea. It was not uncommon for men to speak to the light as if it were a living companion. The Lighthouse Board in Washington, D.C. kept records of disciplinary reports from across the coast. Some of them read like confessions, men refusing to leave their posts after their shifts ended, others found muttering at dawn about voices beneath the surf. The reports were filed without comment, stamped and forgotten. To the service, what mattered was that the lamp stayed lit. During this time, the country was changing rapidly. The war had left scars, mental, physical, and economic. Men returned home to a world that had moved on without them. Industrialization was rising, but so was distrust in technology. The influenza pandemic of 1918 had left grief in every town. People sought meaning wherever they could find it, in religion, in superstition, or in silence. On the coast, that silence was louder than anywhere else. In the towns nearest to Northpoint, people built their lives around the rhythms of the sea. Fishermen left before dawn, praying the fog would lift before they returned. Children grew up watching the distant flash of the lighthouse at night, each rotation a silent heartbeat across the water. Wives waited for the supply boat that carried letters from husbands stationed on the rocks. The lighthouse was part of their landscape, part of their myth. When a keeper died, the funeral was simple. No body was usually found. The sea gave nothing back. The widow received a pension and a folded flag. The next man took the post, The light never went out for long. There was a certain reverence around the job, an understanding that it was not meant for everyone. To work a lighthouse was to disappear willingly, to be forgotten by design. The keepers themselves knew this. They accepted that if something went wrong, rescue would come too late. And still, they stayed. In 1919, radio transmitters were still rare and unreliable along the northern coast. Communication depended on routine and faith. Each keeper kept a logbook, not just for records, but for sanity. A blank page was a kind of danger. It meant a day had slipped by uncounted, unacknowledged. For the men at Northpoint, their final entries would later become the only evidence that they had ever lived at all. The lighthouse itself was a marvel for its time, built from imported granite, with a Fresnel lens shipped from France. It stood 70 feet above the sea, its light reaching nearly 20 miles across the water. But its foundation was imperfect. The land beneath it shifted with each storm, small cracks spreading through its base over the years. Inspectors noted these faults but never repaired them fully. Funding after the war was thin. The government's attention lay elsewhere. By late autumn of 1919, reports from Northpoint had grown irregular. Supplies arrived late, and the last few log entries mentioned mechanical issues. Nothing serious, just the daily decay of old machinery. Then, in early December, the tone changed. The headkeeper wrote of strange vibrations in the tower, even on calm nights. Another entry noted an unusual humming sound, like wind through a keyhole. The final note, written days before their disappearance, mentioned that the light mechanism was operating smoothly, but that the men were troubled by the noise. No one at the time thought much of it. Every lighthouse made strange sounds. Metal expanding, glass rattling, the sea itself groaning against stone. But in hindsight, those small details became haunting. They suggested awareness, unease, and perhaps something more. To understand the vanishings, one must understand the men who served there, not as victims, but as products of their world. They lived between progress and superstition, in a country caught between science and mystery. Theirs was an era when electricity still felt like magic, and nature was both worshipped and feared. The sea to them was not a metaphor. It was a force that demanded obedience. And those who guarded its edge were chosen not for bravery, but for their willingness to be forgotten. When the light at Northpoint went dark in 1919, it wasn't just a mechanical failure. It was a signal, a moment when silence swallowed duty, and the modern world's thin line of certainty gave way to the unknown. And somewhere, within that fog, 3 men crossed that line. It began quietly, as such things often do, not with screams or thunder, but with sound. A faint vibration deep in the stone, as though the tower itself had begun to breathe. Thomas Grady noticed it first. He described it in the logbook as a pulse from the ground, steady, almost rhythmic. The others thought little of it. Out there, the world was never still. The sea was always shifting, the earth always moving, but the feeling stayed. It came at night, after the lantern was lit, when the fog pressed against the windows and the horizon vanished. That December, the fog was thicker than anyone could remember. It rolled in off the Pacific and clung to the cliffs for weeks, swallowing light and sound alike. The beam from Northpoint barely reached the water's edge. The supply ship was overdue by 3 days, leaving the keepers with dwindling rations and an unshakable sense that time had stopped moving. Inside, the air smelled of oil and damp metal. The clock ticked endlessly, marking hours that no longer seemed real. Elias Ward, the youngest, began keeping a small journal of his own, scraps of paper tucked beneath his mattress. His handwriting was uneven, restless. In one entry he wrote, "I woke last night to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Thought it was the old man, but his bunk was empty. I found him at the top, staring out into the dark. He said he saw something in the water. When I looked, there was nothing." That same night, Walter Hill reported hearing the same thing, footsteps when no one was moving. At first, they assumed exhaustion. The weeks had been long, the weather merciless. They spoke little during the day, each lost in his own silence. But as the nights dragged on, the unease deepened. Grady's next entry was shorter. Fog unbroken, light steady, sounds continue, no further explanation. By the second week of December, tension had grown sharp. The men argued over small things, maintenance schedules, food, whose turn it was to check the oil. Hill, known for his calmness, snapped at Ward for leaving the hatch unlatched. Grady intervened, his voice low but final. Afterward, none spoke for hours. The tower, tall and narrow, felt smaller each day. Then came the second incident. On the evening of December 14th, Hill went outside to secure the weather instruments. The wind had risen slightly and mist drifted around the base of the tower. Ward stayed at the lamp, tending the wick. Grady remained below, writing at his desk. When Hill didn't return, Grady climbed the stairs and found the door to the walkway wide open. The railing outside was slick with moisture, but there were no footprints, no sign of anyone. The fog had swallowed everything. Minutes later, Hill appeared at the base of the stairs, soaked to the bone. He looked pale, his lips trembling. He told them he'd seen something, a figure in the fog standing at the edge of the platform facing the sea. It hadn't moved or spoken, but when he stepped toward it, it vanished. Grady scolded him for imagination. "No one's out there," he said. "Keep your mind clear." But Hill wouldn't be calmed. That night, he refused to sleep in his bunk. Instead, he sat near the base of the lamp, watching the fog through the glass, muttering to himself. Ward later wrote that he could hear him whispering, over and over, "It's looking back." The following morning, the fog lifted briefly, revealing the cliffs below. What they saw made no sense. Large circular impressions dotted the wet rock near the waterline, as though something heavy had pressed into it from above. Each mark was nearly perfect, smooth, even, and deep. They took note of it in the logbook, but offered no explanation. That afternoon, the vibration returned. Stronger this time, rattling the utensils on the table and sending small ripples through the lamp's oil. The sound came from beneath the floor, not the sea. The men stood together listening. Grady descended into the maintenance chamber to check the foundation, but found nothing unusual. No cracks, no loose stone. Yet the noise continued, a steady low hum that seemed to move through the air itself. Ward grew restless. He asked permission to signal the mainland, but Grady refused. "We report at the end of the month," he said. No panic before then. Duty above fear. That had always been his way. That night, Ward couldn't sleep. The hum had become unbearable, rising and falling like a distant engine. Around midnight, he climbed to the lantern room and found Hill still awake. The older man was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes unfocused, staring at the rotating beam. The light turned across his face in intervals, revealing something hollow in his expression. When Ward called his name, Hill didn't respond. Moments later, Grady appeared. His voice was sharp. "Back to bed," he ordered. Neither man moved. Then, as the keeper stepped closer, the light flickered. Once, twice, then steadied again. But in that brief darkness, Ward swore he saw the window's reflection change. For a heartbeat, 3 shapes stood there, not 2. He wrote about it later, though his words were uncertain. There was something behind us. Not man, not shadow, just shape. When the light passed again, it was gone. The following morning, Hill was missing. His bed was empty, the blankets folded neatly, his coat gone. The outer door was closed and locked from the inside. No footprints, no rope, no trace. Grady and Ward searched the entire tower, even the cliffs below. Nothing. The logbook entry for that day was terse. Keeper Hill absent. Presumed lost to sea. The silence afterward was unbearable. Ward stopped writing for 2 days. Grady worked without speaking. At night, the humming deepened, pulsing like a heartbeat through the walls. Ward began sleeping with his boots on. On December 18th, a storm finally came. The wind screamed across the tower, rain slashing through every crack. Grady insisted on securing the outer platform himself, despite Ward's protest. Hours passed. The tower groaned under the force of the sea. Ward waited at the base of the stairs, listening. Then came the sound, a single sharp crack, like something splitting apart. He rushed up, but the door to the platform stood open, rain blowing in. Grady was gone. His lantern lay overturned, still burning faintly against the wind. Ward's final hours were pieced together from the last pages of his notes. His handwriting was frantic, uneven. "He's gone. I hear them calling from the water. I can't see them, but I know they're near. The light won't stop spinning. It's too bright." The final line was written in larger, broken letters. "It's under us." After that, nothing. When the relief crew arrived days later, they found the scene almost untouched. The lamp had burned out. The table was still set. and the clock on the wall had stopped at 8:47. There were no bodies, no footprints, no signs of violence. Only the faint echo of something that didn't belong, the low, hollow hum still reverberating through the stones, fading only when the door was open to the wind. The official report would state the obvious: lost to the sea during maintenance, bodies unrecovered. But the men who stood in that lighthouse knew better. They spoke quietly of the air that seemed too thick, of the strange resonance still humming beneath the floor. One sailor swore that as they left he heard a knock from inside the wall, 3 slow taps evenly spaced. When asked later what he thought it was, he simply said, "Someone answering." When news of the disappearance reached the mainland, it came in fragments. A short telegraph sent from the relief crew to the Lighthouse service office in Seattle read simply, "Northpoint Station unmanned. Conditions orderly. 3 keepers missing." It was the kind of message bureaucrats knew how to file away. Brief, bloodless, and unspecific. But the ocean towns nearby heard it differently. In the bars along the docks, in the pews of small wooden churches, and in the narrow kitchens where widows boiled coffee before dawn, the story grew teeth. The newspapers were the first to shape it. The Seattle Daily Times ran a small piece on December 27, 1919. Under the headline, "Mystery at Northpoint. Keepers vanish without trace." It was a modest article, buried near the back pages. But by the following week, the tone had changed. The Port Angeles Gazette published witness statements from fishermen who claimed to have seen strange lights near the cliffs and heard what they called the singing sea. Reporters began using phrases like unearthly, silence, and haunted coast. Readers, hungry for distraction in the bleak winter after war and pandemic, devoured every word. For the families of the missing men, the attention brought little comfort. Thomas Grady's wife, Eleanor, traveled from Tacoma to identify her husband's belongings. She found them neatly arranged on his bunk, his watch, his pipe, his Bible, exactly as if he had set them aside before stepping out. She wrote a letter to the Lighthouse board demanding a full inquiry, but the response was curt. The cause of disappearance presumed accidental. Case considered closed. The phrase, "presumed accidental," became a kind of shield for officials who preferred silence over speculation. Walter Hill's wife, Margaret, refused to accept the explanation. She told anyone who would listen that her husband was not the sort of man to lose himself to the sea. She insisted he had written her a letter a week before the event saying he was uneasy about something beneath the foundation. The letter was later lost, or perhaps never taken seriously. By spring, Margaret had left Washington entirely, moving inland to live with relatives. Neighbors said she never spoke of the ocean again. Among the keeper's colleagues, the case spread like an infection. Men stationed at other lighthouses began to report sleeplessness, strange dreams, and an irrational dread during fog. The lighthouse service quietly reassigned several of them, but rumors persisted. In official memos, supervisors began referring to Northpoint as unstable terrain, citing erosion as the reason it would not be reactivated. Yet the real instability, it seemed, was psychological. The incident had shaken faith in the very idea of isolation as duty. The public's fascination only deepened. Local preachers used the story as a warning, proof that man's pride in mastering nature would always end in humility. To them, the sea was not an accident of geography, but a living force that punished trespass. Parishioners nodded in quiet agreement. It was easier to believe in punishment than in chaos. In contrast, a small group of scientists from the University of Washington offered a colder theory. They argued that infrasound, low-frequency vibrations produced by the interaction of wind and cliff, could cause panic, hallucination, even death. The phenomenon had been observed elsewhere, though poorly understood. They suggested the men may have been overcome by fear, disoriented by sound waves too deep for the ear to detect, and fallen accidentally into the sea. It was a rational idea, but no one wanted reason. Fear explained more than science could. By early 1920, Northpoint had become a legend. Sailors refused to sail too near its coordinates after dark. Some claimed their compasses spun wildly within a mile of the shore. Others reported seeing a dim light flicker through the fog, pulsing 3 times, pausing, then repeating. The pattern matched the old rotation of Northpoint's lamp, though the mechanism had long been dismantled. A few of the younger fishermen turned the story into a superstition, If the light appeared, it meant a storm was coming. If you looked directly at it, you'd lose your way home. In taverns, the tale was retold endlessly. Some swore that Grady had gone mad and killed the others before walking into the sea. Others insisted the men had been taken by something that rose from the water, a sound that learned to take shape. By the time summer came, the details had drifted far from fact. The human mind prefers patterns to emptiness, and Northpoint became a canvas for every fear the coast had ever known. The government did what it always did with such stories. It buried them in paperwork. By 1921, the incident had been formally archived under maritime accidents. The lighthouse itself was sealed, its lens removed, its tower left to rot. A new automatic beacon was installed miles away, manned by no one. Progress, they called it. The less human involvement, the safer the light. But the people who lived closest to the sea never forgot. Fishermen still avoided the cliffs. Children dared one another to approach the old path at night, only to turn back when the wind began to hum through the rocks. And every few years, when a storm washed debris onto the shore, an old boot, a piece of metal, a fragment of glass, someone would claim it came from Northpoint. In later years, folklorists began to collect these stories. They found that almost every version ended the same way, with 3 knocks. Sometimes on a door, sometimes on a window, sometimes deep beneath the floorboards. Always 3, always evenly spaced. Even the skeptics admitted the case had power. It lingered in the collective imagination because it asked a question no one could answer cleanly. How do 3 men vanish in perfect silence? Some said madness, some said the sea, but others, those who had lived too long listening to the wind, said it was neither. They said the lighthouse itself had listened too long, and something had finally listened back. The disappearance of the Northpoint keepers became part of the coastline's identity, an unspoken reminder of how fragile the boundary is between order and oblivion. Every generation retold it a little differently, polishing it like a piece of sea glass, smoothing its edges until it fit their fears. What had begun as tragedy became a mirror, and somewhere, within the sound of the waves, the echo of that loss still travels. Not loud but steady, the same hum the men once heard in the walls, a frequency between memory and myth. By the spring of 1920, the investigation had gone cold. Official reports were boxed and stored. The sea returned to its rhythm, the gulls to their cries, and the cliffs to their quiet decay. Only the old supply captain, Robert Hensley, refused to let it rest. He had been the one to deliver provisions to Northpoint the week before the disappearance, and something about that final visit stayed with him. The way the fog had rolled in too quickly, the stillness that hung in the air, and Grady's last words, "The light hums at night, Bob. You hear it if you listen long enough." One night in late May, Hensley decided to go back. He told no one, not even his wife. He loaded his small cutter with a lantern, rope, and a single revolver, then set off before dawn. The sea was calm, unnaturally so. The water was a pane of glass reflecting a colorless sky. As he approached the cliffs, the ruins of Northpoint appeared through the haze like a skeleton, its tower leaning, its glass shattered, its keepers' quarters choked with salt and moss. The place looked dead, but the light still flickered. At first, he thought it was an illusion. The lantern room's glass had long since been removed. There was no lens, no flame, no power source of any kind. Yet, faintly a glow pulsed inside. 3 flashes, a pause, then 3 again. Hensley dropped anchor and stared. The pattern was exact. The rotation speed, perfect. The only explanation he could offer himself was madness, or perhaps memory. But when he turned off his own lantern to see more clearly, he realized the light was responding. With each of his breaths, it seemed to brighten, as if the tower itself were breathing with him. He climbed the rocks slowly, each step scraping against stone slick with mist. The wind rose, low and deep, vibrating through the ground. By the time he reached the base of the tower, the sound had taken form. Not quite a voice, not quite a note, but something between. It wasn't coming from above. It came from within the rock beneath his feet. The door to the keeper's quarters was open, swinging slightly, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. Inside, the rooms were as they had been left months before. Plates on the table, coats on their hooks. A half-written entry still on the logbook. The hum tonight is stronger. The floor moves as though the sea is beneath us. Hensley ran his fingers over the ink. It was dry but unfaded, as if written yesterday. He turned toward the stairs leading up to the tower and froze. 3 wet footprints, bare, human, led upward. He followed them. Each step creaked, echoing in a rhythm that didn't quite match his own. At the top, the lantern room was empty. No lens, no oil lamp, no machinery, just the glow. It hung in the air like a pulse, a soft white shimmer that throbbed in time with the sea below. The air was thick and warm, as if the light itself gave off heat. And there, in the faintest reflection of the cracked window pane, Hensley saw 3 figures. Not standing, not solid, but present. They were looking out to sea, their faces turned away. He called their names once, twice. The echo that came back wasn't his voice, it was theirs, layered, distant, as if carried by miles of water. Then came the knock. 3 sharp strikes, not from the door, but from deep inside the stone foundation. The floor trembled. The light flared once blindingly and went out. When Hensley came to, he was lying on the shore at dawn. His boat was gone. His hands were cut, his clothes soaked with salt. He was found wandering near a small fishing village 20 miles south, speaking incoherently about the men who wouldn't leave. His story spread fast. Some said he'd gone mad. Others said he had seen something no man should have. The authorities dismissed it as trauma and exposure. But the villagers who found him told a different version, that when they pulled him from the surf, his skin glowed faintly, like a lantern wick still burning beneath the surface. Weeks later, a salvage team was sent to dismantle the remains of the tower. They reported strange phenomena, tools that vanished, compasses that spun in circles, the persistent sound of knocking when the waves hit the rock. One diver claimed to have found an opening beneath the lighthouse, a kind of hollow cavity in the cliff that wasn't on any geological map. He descended only once. When he resurfaced, he refused to describe what he saw, saying only that the light comes from below. The dismantling never finished. A storm hit 2 days later, tearing the structure apart. Debris scattered for miles, and the last remnants of the lighthouse sank into the sea. Officially, the Northpoint Light ceased to exist. Unofficially, sailors still reported seeing a faint glow where it once stood. Some said it followed their ships for hours before fading. Years passed. Hensley never returned to the water. He lived quietly inland, never speaking of that night except once to a priest, who later recounted the confession in a letter. He said they weren't gone. He said the light kept them. He said the sea was only the surface, and beneath it, the real watch began, even decades later. Fishermen swore that during the worst storms, when the coast was nothing but black horizon and white foam, a single light could be seen flashing through the fog. 3 times, pause, 3 again. Always in the same rhythm, always at the same place where the keepers vanished. Whether it was a trick of the weather, a remnant of memory, or something older than both, no one could say. But those who saw it agreed on one thing: the light didn't warn of danger anymore. It was a signal from the deep, a reminder that the sea keeps what it takes, and on certain nights, when the wind carries the sound across the coast, you can still hear it. Not the waves, not the gulls, but the slow, steady hum that started it all. The hum of Northpoint, the sound of the light refusing to die. Decades passed, and the story of Northpoint faded into that quiet corner of memory where sea legends go to sleep. By the 1940s, the last officials who had handled the case were gone. Their files yellowed in storage, their notes unread, their signatures barely legible under the weight of dust. The lighthouse no longer existed on any map. The coast was redrawn, the cliffs renamed, and still, the locals refused to build there. They said the ground hummed. They said the sea was louder at Northpoint. When historians revisited the case in the 1970s, they found something odd. The seismic readings from that region showed faint, rhythmic vibrations, 3 short pulses, then silence. At first, scientists blamed passing ships or underwater fault movement. But the pattern didn't match natural activity. It was too precise, too deliberate, and it occurred only at night. Some called it coincidence. Others called it persistence. Meanwhile, folklorists gathered what remained of the oral histories. They spoke with the children of the men who once tended the sea lights, keepers who had grown up fearing isolation but respecting it. Many still kept a small lantern burning in their windows, a family tradition said to guide the keepers home. They couldn't explain why the gesture mattered. It simply did, as if somewhere out there something was still watching for that faint, Human flicker of warmth. Psychologists who studied maritime isolation later referred to Northpoint as a case of collective haunting. They argued that the story's endurance had less to do with ghosts and more to do with what loneliness does to the human mind. To stand alone between sea and sky, hearing only the pulse of water and the wind's voice, is to brush against something ancient in ourselves, something that resists being seen. Perhaps the men weren't taken by anything external at all. Perhaps they simply crossed an unseen threshold, lost to the silence they were meant to keep at bay, and yet the evidence still resists dismissal. Divers in the 1980s, exploring the same stretch of coast, reported discovering fragments of metal and glass fused into the seabed, as if a heat had melted the structure from within. Their instruments recorded unusual electromagnetic interference. When one diver resurfaced, he claimed to have heard a low tone inside his helmet, like a heartbeat through the rock. His colleagues dismissed it as pressure distortion. But when the audio was later reviewed, 3 faint pulses were audible on the recording. For the locals, no explanation was ever necessary. They still say the light calls to those who listen too closely. Fishermen claim their radios sometimes catch stray signals, brief bursts of static that form the outline of words. Always the same, man the light. The phrase repeats 3 times before fading. The shoreline itself has changed little. Wild grass covers what was once the path to the tower. The foundation stones remain buried, blackened by age and tide. On certain fog-heavy mornings, travelers claim to see a shimmer above the water, a flicker, not bright but distinct, like a breath of white between the waves. The Coast Guard calls it optical refraction. The old men in town call it memory. There is a theory, rarely spoken outside quiet circles of maritime historians, that the keeper's disappearance marked a turning point in lighthouse history. After Northpoint, automation became the new standard. Machines replaced men. Light replaced presence. Progress, they said. But perhaps it wasn't progress at all. Just a way to keep distance between the living and whatever had begun to listen out there. Some say the light was never meant to warn ships, but to seal something beneath. A threshold disguised as a beacon. When the men vanished, the seal broke, and the sound returned to the deep where it came from. Whether metaphor or truth, no one can say. The ocean holds its secrets tightly, and it does not forgive intrusion. In 1997, a research vessel passing the site picked up an anomaly, an electromagnetic pulse, steady, rhythmic. When converted into audio frequency, it matched a human heartbeat. The pattern repeated for exactly 6 minutes before ceasing altogether. The vessel's captain, a practical man with decades at sea, refused to record the coordinates in the ship's log. When asked why, he said, "Because it's still theirs." And maybe he was right. Maybe some places are not meant to fade, no matter how time buries them. The Northpoint Light exists now only in fragments. A line in a ledger, a photograph blurred by fog, a sound too deep to name. But in every version of the story, one thing remains constant: the rhythm. 3 beats, a pause. 3 again. It is the pulse of loss, of endurance, of something that outlasts explanation. The hum beneath the sea that reminds us how small we are against what waits in the dark. And if one night you find yourself near the Washington coast, listening to the wind over the cliffs, you might hear it too. Not the sea, not the wind, but a faint vibration in the air, steady and patient, the sound of a duty never ended, and a light that refuses to die.